Hey guys, welcome back to 90 Feet From Home. I'm your host Ashley, and this week we're going to talk about free agency. Now, this was one selected by you guys on Twitter, and sometimes I'm going to post those polls asking for opinions on what you want to see next, and both spring training and free agency were top of list for you guys. So this one is for you. Now, while we're at the top of the show, I'm going to remind you to hit that subscribe button down below and ring that bell so that you get notifications every time I have a new episode out, which is every Tuesday and Thursday. And remember, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at 90 Feet From Home. And I'm going to remind you guys about all that at the end of the episode as well. So remember, subscribe, tell your friends, leave comments, all that fun stuff. We're going to talk free agency. Now, this one is one of those things that's on everyone's mind right now because there are still a bunch of free agents left on the market. Free agency has kind of taken a really interesting turn in the last 2 seasons, with teams kind of leaning more towards analytics to determine whether or not a player is actually worth the value that they may have once considered to be years ago. In previous years, when a major star like Bryce Harper hit the free agent market, there would be a clamor of teams trying to get that player to sign with them. So you'd see these huge offers, or teams would make massive contract extension offers, like the Washington Nationals did for Bryce Harper. It was rumored that he was offered a $300 million contract extension from the Washington Nationals, which he turned down in favor of going on the free agent market. So that would have been a bonkers, enormous extension, like one of the biggest extensions in the history of pro sports. But he said no. And as it turns out, he did so for a good reason. So we're going to talk about what free agency is, a little bit about arbitration, and at the end of this, we'll talk about some of the biggest free agent contracts ever signed and some of the biggest non-free agency contracts ever signed, because there is a difference between the two, and you will feel very, very poor by the end of this episode. So my apologies. Go look at your sad, empty bank account. That's what I did after this. Imagine what you would do with $300 million over 10 years. I, quite frankly, cannot. But I also can't hit a baseball, so that's probably why I am not making those big bucks. Free agency as we know it started in 1976 with that year's collective bargaining agreement, or CBA. That version of free agency isn't quite the same as what we see today, because that 1976 version included tiers for the quality of players. So there was a type A player, a type B player, and then the unclassifieds, which when you think about it is kind of an awful way to break players down. The type A's were considered the top 20% of players. The type B were the 20% just below that. And then the bottom 60% of free agent players were the unclassifieds, which sounds awful every time I say it. That version of free agency basically allowed teams that were losing a type A or type B player to get more back in return if they offered them an arbitration settlement at the end of their contract. The unclassifieds, however, wouldn't get quite as much in return, and we're not going to get into that because it's just not how free agency is handled anymore. Ahead of the 2012 season, a new CBA was signed and they did away with the tiers of players. So there's no longer any type A, type B unclassified players. Instead, teams can offer a pending free agent an arbitration salary, which is a 1-year deal that is an average of the top 125 salaries across the league. So that value changes every year, and you'll hear it mentioned, and I'm going to do some research and throw the value of the 2018 amount on the screen. So basically, a player with 6 or more years of service time on the 40-man roster, meaning they're playing at a major league level, is eligible for free agency if they do not have a contract in place for the next season. This can be players that have had contract extensions in the past, or players who have just reached the end of their arbitration eligible years. We'll talk about arbitration a little bit in a second, but basically anyone with 6 years or above of service time at a major league level and who does not have a contract in place for the following season becomes a free agent. This means that they can go into the open market and choose to play for any team who is willing to make them an offer. In the case of guys who are going into their first year of free agent eligibility, these are still very young players. And in the case of guys like Mike Trout, who will be eligible for free agency in 2020, as well as Tigers outfielder Nicholas Castellanos, they're looking at potentially very big, long-term, very expensive contracts. In this 2019 offseason, there were 2 major stars who were entering free agency for the first time. Manny Machado, who was formerly with the Baltimore Orioles and then was traded to the Los Angeles Dodgers ahead of the 2018 postseason, and then Bryce Harper, who was formerly with the Washington Nationals. And these are both all-star level players who have shown that they are incredibly skilled, great defensively and offensively. And these are guys that people assumed would get snapped up almost immediately with major contracts. And yet with the way free agency is going, teams are really biding their time signing guys like this to deals. So it did take the bulk of the 2018-2019 offseason for Harper and Machado to get offered deals. Now, when they did get offered deals, they were massive. They were incredible, history-making deals. And we're going to talk about that in a second because these are the kind of contracts that will just blow your mind. But first, let's talk about arbitration. A player with more than 3 years, but fewer than 6 years of service time with a team is what we consider to be arbitration eligible. There are certain players who have 2 years of service time who are considered Super 2 players that are eligible for arbitration as well, but we're not going to get into Super 2. It's a lot more nuanced and it could be its own video, but just know that if you ever hear of a player who only has 2 years of service time getting arbitration salary, that's because he would be considered a Super 2 player. Just put that note in the mental vault and we'll talk about it in more detail at a later episode. But for now, more than 3 years, but fewer than 6, you're arbitration eligible. And basically what this means is that a player is allowed to look at any new contracts or contracts that are comparable to theirs and come back to the team and suggest an increase in their own salary. Typically, teams will offer a slight increase from year to year for these players in hopes of avoiding any kind of an arbitration settlement. And often these kind of agreements can be reached without any kind of conflict between the player and the team. Usually they find a happy medium between what the player wants and what the team was willing to pay. If by mid-January the player and the team don't agree on a value for their contract, they actually go into what's called an arbitration hearing, where a panel of arbiters will sit with and listen to both the player and the team and hear out both sides. These can get quite contentious. In 2018, Cleveland Indians pitcher Trevor Bauer went to an arbitration settlement hearing with the Indians, and apparently they drudged up a lot of personal details about his use of Twitter, and he called it a character assassination. Now, whether or not that was the case is between him and the Indians, but these trials can get a little bit ugly sometimes. And at the end of it, the panel will decide whether or not they side with the team or with the player. And based on who they side with, that is the agreed upon salary for the following season. So it's not like if a player loses that they don't play for the team the next year, they just don't make the value of the contract that they set forth as what they wanted to make for that year. And typically the following season, they'll go back and try to negotiate again based on what's fair. Now, the reason teams wouldn't want to pay a player what they feel is their value is that perhaps there's been injury or a drop in how the player is performing, and those are all reasons why a team may not agree to pay what the player is asking for. So of course the team doesn't want to pay as much as the player wants to earn. That's just how things work, but usually they can find an agreement between both sides and fixate on a value that actually works for everyone involved. So free agency is different because after a team offers the free agent player an arbitration level salary, which is again the value of the top 125 valued contracts averaged out, most of the players going into free agency will decline that offer because they believe that they can make more money on the free agent market. And if they do end up going on the free agent market, then teams can negotiate directly with the player, although more typically they'll negotiate with the player's agent to come up with a length of term and an overall value of contract that works best for the player. Older players, perhaps who've already had long-term or have already signed free agent deals in the past and are maybe getting into their mid-30s, which unfortunately is considered kind of middle-aged by baseball standards. I know. It hurts me personally too. Those players may end up being willing to sign one-year deals, or even in the case of what we've been seeing lately in the offseason, a lot of these aging or injury-prone players will often sign minor league deals where they'll agree to report to a minor league camp or play on a AAA team for their chosen club with the hopes that if they make it to that major league level, they'll earn bonuses based on that. It's kind of sad, especially when you see guys who have been at the top of their game, former all-star players, and they sign on to one-year minor league deals just in the hope that they get to reach that major league level again. But for the young guys, for the Bryce Harpers, for the Manny Machados, the deals can be incredibly lucrative, often negatively so for teams in the future, especially if those players get injured or fail to live up to expectations. But honestly, what the deals are hoping to get the best 4 or 5 years out of a player while paying for 10 years of their time. It's all a gamble, and teams are generally willing to make that gamble if they think that it can help their team achieve a World Series win or, several postseason berths in a row. Let's talk about the top 10 free agency contracts of all time. I've mentioned Bryce Harper a couple times on here, and it's for good reason, because Bryce Harper is now officially the highest free agent contract signing in the history of North American sports, with a 13-year deal worth $330 million with the Philadelphia Phillies. And what's more important is that it actually managed to beat out the major contract of Manny Machado, signed only a few weeks earlier with the San Diego Padres, which was worth $300 million over 10 years. So it was almost like they were waiting each other out in the free agent market, trying to determine who could get the best deal. And it looks like Bryce Harper's agent, Scott Boras, was able to hold on just long enough to make it worth an extra $30 million in 3 years. The third and fourth highest free agent contracts of all time both go to Alex Rodriguez. One was with the New York Yankees, and it was for 10 years and $275 million. Yikes, because that was over a decade ago, and that's no joke. That's real money. Now, the other A-Rod contract was with the Texas Rangers. It was also for 10 years and worth $252 million. And what's funny about that is that he only actually played 3 years with the Rangers before being traded back to the Yankees, where he then signed another contract later on, and A-Rod is not lacking for any kind of money, as we can tell. The fifth highest contract is actually a tie between Albert Pujols, who signed with the Los Angeles Angels at 10 years for $240 million, and Robinson Cano, who signed with the Seattle Mariners for the same amount and the same amount of time. By comparison, David Price's $217 million for 7 years with the Red Sox is a pretty small amount? No, it's not. It's insane. It's still a lot of money. And then there was the Prince Fielder deal with the Detroit Tigers, which was 9 years and $214 million. And what's funny about that is that the Tigers also ended up trading him to the Texas Rangers for Ian Kinsler, and Fielder was subsequently injured to the point where his doctor told him it would be beneficial for him to not continue with baseball and to retire, and there's still an amount of the Prince Fielder contract kicking around on the Tigers payroll to this day. So man, when I tell you that some of these free agency deals really hurt the team in the long run, I'm not kidding. The 9th and 10th top contracts both go to pitchers. Max Scherzer, who signed with the Nationals for a 7-year contract, is actually paid out over 14 years, which is an interesting deferred contract that not a lot of teams can get away with doing. So his 7-year, $210 million deal is actually going to be paid out over the course of 14 years, which is a really cushy deal for the Nationals, who, yes, will be carrying his contract for 7 years after he potentially retires or moves on to another team, but the average annual value of that contract isn't so much as to sink them from being able to sign another lucrative player after he moves on. And speaking of average annual value, Zach Greinke of the D-backs gets probably one of the best contracts of all of them. He signed a 6-year deal worth $206.5 million, meaning even though his is a shorter contract with a lower value, by comparison, the actual average annual value of that contract is one of the highest in sports. Now, you may have heard of some other massive contracts and you're wondering why I haven't mentioned them. And that's because some of these contracts are part of a trade where an extension is negotiated in addition to the trade, or it's a team extension offered prior to free agency, meaning the team and the player came to an agreement on extending their contract beyond the current year or the coming year and offered them a long-term deal that was beneficial to both the team and the player. A lot of times the players just want to stick with the team that they've been with since the beginning. So these kind of contracts aren't actually all that uncommon, and it's a great way for teams to keep fan favorites or really high quality players on their roster for a longer term without risking losing them to the free agent market. So some of those contracts include the massive deal that sent Giancarlo Stanton from the Miami Marlins to the New York Yankees. Now, Stanton's contract at the time was one of the biggest ever seen in baseball, and it was a 13-year deal worth $325 million, so very close to what Bryce Harper ended up getting, just, without the nuances of that free agent market being entered into the picture. So this is future Ashley interjecting a small sidebar here. But pretty much 3 days after I recorded this episode, the Los Angeles Angels signed Mike Trout to the biggest contract extension and also largest North American sports contract in history, a 12-year deal worth $426.5 million. So while it does not break Bryce Harper's gigantic free agency contract, it is the single biggest North American sports contract ever signed, kind of blowing Harper's out of the water. So while Harper remains on top for free agency, this one does have to go to the top of my extension contract list. So there you go, an update for you. Also this offseason, Nolan Arenado of the Colorado Rockies signed an 8-year extension worth a whopping $260 million, but definitely great for them and for him to be able to keep that connection together. And then another massive Tigers contract was that of Miguel Cabrera, who signed an 8-year extension with the team worth $248 million, meaning he would be playing with them well into his 40s. And they're already kind of seeing the negative impacts of that, in that his health isn't what it once was. And that's sort of what I mean. You've got the best years of Miguel Cabrera, like the 2012, 2013 years where he was a Triple Crown winner, all-star, hit leader, just one of the greatest batters of all time. Then you get the aging years where, you know, health is an issue and he becomes a DH and things are not always that great. It's the pros and cons of free agency and a contract extension. You are paying for the prime and then you get the decline. So what do you guys think? Are baseball players paid too much? Is free agency broken? Are these contracts worth it for the teams that have signed them? Will Manny Machado lead the San Diego Padres to their first World Series in 30 some years? Who knows? It's hard to tell. Leave your comments below. Tell me if there is another topic you would like to see a video on. Click that subscribe button if you haven't already. Click the thumbs up if you liked it. And remember to follow me on social media. I'm everywhere on the web at 90 feet from home. And I hope you enjoyed this episode and you'll come back next Tuesday or Thursday to see the next one. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Bye.